The structure which you're working on is really not difficult. You see the letter broken into 3 bigger units. The first 7 chapters, and then you have the 2 chapters on the offering, and then you have the final 4 chapters which are addressing the super apostles. I'm sure that's your goal, to be a super apostle. No, all right. And so, building on what I was suggesting earlier, Paul is defending his message and his ministry to the majority. The reason he's defending his message is because his message is being contradicted or challenged by the false teachers. But also his conduct. His conduct is coming under question. His conduct because of his change of plans, for example. His enemies or his opponents were using that as evidence that he was double-minded and untrustworthy. His opponents, or the perception of the Corinthians, was the fact that he suffered undermined his credibility. It would seem they had an understanding that if you were a great apostle, that shouldn't happen. Even in 1 Corinthians, he talks about that in chapter 4. And he remember that bit of sarcasm when he says to them that you are kings, you reign, you're great, you know. And then he says, I wish that were true. And then he contrasts his own experience as an apostle with the suffering he goes through. And you'll notice that that portion in chapter 4, where he talks about we're fools for the sake of Christ, but you are wise. We are weak, but you are strong. You're held in honour, but us in disrepute. And then he talks about being hungry and thirsty and poorly clothed and beaten and homeless. That kind of language is repeated in 2 Corinthians, only emphasised even more. So he is defending his message and his ministry to the majority in the first part, and those that have been won back, if you like, by the severe letter. And he says this, if you look at chapter 5, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 12, he kind of says it quite clearly. For we are not commending ourselves to you again, but giving you an opportunity to boast in us, so that, and so that there is, so that is always important when you see a so that, so that you may be able to answer those who boast in outward appearance and not in the heart. In other words, he is giving an answer about accusations or judgments so that they would know how to respond to people who would be looking at the outward. And that's what the super apostles are doing, boasting about the outward and not the reality. And so we see he addresses different things. I'm not suggesting these are necessarily good segment breaks, that's for you to decide. But he talks about the change of plans. He talks about the message, where he's comparing the old and the new in chapter 3. Makes some very strong statements and contrasts there. He talks in the midst of the glory of the message that came with great glory, a marvellous contrast about the weakness of the messenger. We have this treasure, he says, in earthen vessels. The treasure's glorious, but the vessels are earthen. And then he talks about his commission. One, to bring and to preach reconciliation. And then instruction in separation and pursuing holiness. And then he talks about his comfort as at the coming of the meeting of Titus. And you get that marvellous passage, very personal passage of his sense of relief. And then you get the instruction for the saints about the offering. And this has to be probably the most important passage in the New Testament when it comes to New Testament giving. Jesus said a lot about giving, of course, especially in Luke. And it's in other places, Philippians and other places. But really, when it comes to the New Testament understanding of giving, this, I think, is the clearest and really very important. And then, of course, we have Paul defending himself against the accusations of the false teachers, possibly from Jerusalem, because of the emphasis of what they were teaching. And he's preparing for the third visit. And so, as I mentioned, some would see the letter as different fragments of letters put together. I believe that we can actually see it as a unity, and there's a purpose in it. He does digress at times, but don't we all? There's a coherence as he's addressing different groups.